who are the specific external actors and influencers, players involved in what's happening in the Sudan? And why is the Sudan so important to all of these different players?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. The reason that Sudan is so important, and it's important to emphasize, is on one level, pure geography. It is one of the largest countries on the continent. It borders 7 countries. It is a very important country with respect to the Sahel region, Chad, and of course, going all the way to Mali and West Africa. And as you know, it borders the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean.
Right.
Which makes it both strategically important for those involved in the very rich, resource-rich Sahel region, but it also makes it very important in terms of the Red Sea area. The port of Port Sudan is extremely strategic for a variety of different actors. It's, of course, as you know, the Indian Ocean is a source of competition for America, for China, for Russia, and of course, for the Gulf region. Right. And so there has been historically always a conflict over who is going to take control or have influence over the Red Sea area of Sudan. Only recently, over the past few days, as an example, port workers in the Port of Sudan on the Red Sea have been protesting to kick out the ambassador of the United Arab Emirates. Which historically had wanted to have control and build their own facilities in Port Sudan. Right. So this is just an example. You have the Sahel on one side and the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. In addition to that, Sudan is distinguished in many instances as being both an African and Middle Eastern Arab country. And so the potential, number one, of a democratic Sudan poses a threat to a number of countries, most importantly, of course, Egypt, which is very, very close in Sudan, not only culturally, but politically. That kind of so-called, if you don't mind me using the term, from their perspective, a contagion of democratization, is one of the reasons what we call counter-revolutionary forces in North Africa have worked tirelessly to upend any kind of popular mobilization leading to democracy. That's really important. Another issue of external actors, and here it's key, are Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Both of them have strategic interest in the, of course, Indian Ocean and the Red Sea, of course, but they also have vast economic and financial interest within Sudan in agriculture, and also they perceive Sudan as a gateway to the African markets and resources further afield, south, even to below the Sahara. And so you have a constellation of different interests that are vying. You have on the other side, of course, Ethiopia and its battle with Egypt over the Nile waters, which makes Sudan, of course, principally an existential kind of security issue, both for Egypt and for Ethiopia. In other words, who has influence over the government in Sudan may have influence over this very important water source, the life-giving and energy source of the Nile. And at the same time, they also can forestall or want to forestall any kind of pro-democratic mobilization that could influence these other regions. And finally, or not finally, it's very important to understand the role of Islamism, Islamist politics. Sudan and the regime that was led by Omar al-Bashir is really the only, or was the only regime in the region where a Sunni Arab country, Arab-speaking country, was led by an Islamist authoritarian regime. This, of course, poses a threat to Saudi Arabia that is very much opposed to the Islamist movement. It does so also for Egypt and less so for the United Arab Emirates. But to emphasize the present war and your question, and I think that to simplify matters, so to speak, the United Arab Emirates, we now know, is supplying both financial and military supplies and aid and assistance to the rapid support forces. And this has having a severe impact on the devastation in Darfur, as just one example. And that's important to keep in mind. Egypt also is supporting the army. And so here you have external actors, each supporting a different actor or belligerent in the war. And so, as you know, in all of these conflicts, and thank you for this question, it is not to say that the roots of the conflict, whether in Sudan or elsewhere, are not domestic, but it's important to understand that the sustainability and the dynamics of the conflict are really a result of external intervention and interest. Why is that important? Because it speaks to the efficacy of the peace talks now brokered by Saudi Arabia and the United States versus peace talks brokered, let's say, by the African Union and the regional bloc of IGAD of East and the Horn of Africa. And so we must take into account the specificities and the dramatic influence of external interests, interventions in this conflict, because without that, we won't understand the dynamics of the conflict and even begin to discuss how we can resolve this tragedy in Sudan.
Right, right. There is so many different interests taking part in this. And a lot of people in social media right now also mentioning words like proxy war. And especially in some US media outlets, the over-amplification of the role of the Wagner Group in Sudan. Could you talk about the dangers of this increasingly interventionist movements from across the globe, from the US to Saudi Arabia to Russia to regional actors and everyone else involved? And then you mentioned different peace resolution, people coming together to like advocate for ceasefires and so on. What is the difference between the African Union and what it's doing versus what the other actors are doing? Because whether it is happening in Africa or whether it is happening from outside of Africa, it seems none of these actors have a vested interest in a stabilized, democratic, civilian-led, peaceful, thriving Sudan.
Yes, absolutely. I think that one of the things that is not often considered when looking at African conflicts, although we do have people, of course, talking about the new scramble for Africa, but specifically about these conflicts, they're usually represented as a tragedy, as you put it earlier, between just kind of illogical, irrational, belligerence, or Africans are prone to interethnic enmities and violence. Of course, that's a normal state of affairs. What can we do about it? And the problem is that what is obscured is the fact that all of these conflicts, and Sudan is a prime example, are really played out in a much larger regional geopolitical terrain.
Mm-hmm.
The war in Ukraine is not peripheral to the conflict in Sudan. And what I mean by that is that the scramble for power over the Sahel, for example, is now between not only China, of course, and the US, but France's issues with respect to the Sahel region and its the opposition to it and its history of colonization and occupation. But also Russia is now battling, so to speak, the United States and the West in the Sahel region. And here is where the Wagner Group comes into play. Despite what people may say about the death of the traditional head of the Wagner Group, it is very much a proxy of Russian policy and geopolitics. In many instances, it continues to be very close to the Kremlin. It also is very important in generating gold and smuggled not only to the United Arab Emirates, which receives the bulk of the smuggled gold, but also it's smuggled through Syria to Russia. Most importantly, we have to understand that it plays a very important political, strategic role in that it represents Russia's influence and interest in Africa, as opposed in contradistinction and as a rival to, let's say, US interest and the European Union's interest. So from their perspective, their calculations are with respect to the situation in Sudan is very much either based on that or the fear on the part of the European Union, not so much about, perhaps ending the war, so to speak, but the potential of immigration from Sudan or others to the European Union. Here, all of these interests must be taken into account, not only in Sudan, but in other conflicts, to understand that these conflicts are played out in a much larger geopolitical terrain. And that's what makes them very, very essential. Now, in terms of democracy and peace for Sudan, you have to pose it in a different way, perhaps. I often do that, and that is, what threat does democracy and peace represent for actors? Rather than understand or believe or take kind of without any criticism, this notion that these Western countries, for example, want democracy. We have to understand that a democratic government in Sudan would be unreliable to many of these interests. The will of the Sudanese people who participate in elections may have very different views with respect to military regimes in the region, the use of resources domestically, the smuggling of gold. Sudan is the third largest exporter of gold in the African continent. All of these issues threaten a variety of different interests if a democracy or the will of the people is consolidated. And of course, the majority of Sudanese, especially young people, understand that full well.